It's well known that of all the images from the early church that we have, many of them, including the oldest ones, show Jesus with short hair. And this is especially true of images showing his ministry years. Now, many people interpret these as a Romanized image of Jesus. They say, well, Jews had long hair, and then the early Christians were Roman, so they made Jesus look Roman by giving him short hair. But this is a speculation, and there actually is evidence that he had short hair, at least for some time in his life. And I would like to explore the question in this video: is it possible that Jesus had short hair? Does it contradict the Bible? Does it contradict what we know about first century Jews? And does it contradict other witnesses of Jesus's appearance? So let's talk about it. First, I want to get into some positive arguments for Jesus having short hair, and then examine whether or not I think they're good arguments. So the first one is 1 Corinthians 11:14. It says, "Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him?" So this is a really weird thing for Paul to say as a Jew, if it was typical for Jews to have long hair. It would also be a weird thing for him to say if he saw Jesus with long hair. What makes this a really strong argument, I think, for Jesus having short hair is that the church fathers generally take Paul at his word on it, considering long hair a fault. So I was looking in the church fathers for any kind of interpretation where they say, he doesn't really mean that, it's just some cultural thing. But the fathers actually seem to agree with Paul and say, yep, it's forbidden. Short hair is the only way to go. But going a little bit deeper into the patristic understanding of this passage, the target of it is people who let their hair grow long and kind of wild as a demonstration of false piety and mourning over their sins. So St. John Chrysostom writes, "Others again think it a sign of piety to wear long hair, and yet this is amongst the things forbidden and carries with it much disgrace." St. Augustine writes, "The very disgrace, say they being those with long hair, we take upon us for desert of our sins, holding out a screen of simulated humility, to the end that under cover of it they may carry on their trade of self-importance." So the target of this verse, according to the fathers, is not really just long hair in general, but it's these people who are demonstrating false piety by letting their hair grow out and go raggedy so that they can display this sort of self-pity for their sins. So in this context, it seems less likely that a simple long hairstyle is in mind, and more likely it refers to a disheveled and neglected look, which is the kind of hair that you would expect to see for people mourning over their sins as a demonstrated false piety. And certainly if Jesus had long hair, it would have been well kept and not a demonstration of mourning and false piety, obviously. So this verse wouldn't technically apply to him in that kind of context. So there's a context issue here. But there are other reasons why this verse might not be the best argument for Jesus having short hair. The scriptures, ancient Jews, and the church fathers are all clear that there are exceptions for hair length depending on vocation. And one of those is well known. It's the Nazarite vow in the Bible. Numbers 6:5 says, "No razor shall come upon his head. He shall let the locks of his head grow." So obviously Nazarites are an exception to this general rule that Paul seems to be laying out. He wouldn't call Nazarites dishonorable for having long hair. There's also some evidence in the scriptures that priests wore long hair. Leviticus 21:5 in the Masoretic text says, "They," that's the priests, "shall not make any bald place on their heads." This might be a reference to cutting their hair. The Septuagint adds the words "for a dead person," so maybe this is actually like a religious tonsure, but still it's worth considering. Ezekiel 44:20 in the Masoretic text, it says, "They shall neither shave their heads," it's talking about priests in a vision of the future temple, "nor let their hair grow long, but they shall keep their hair well trimmed." So this could be, again, long hair reference to that disheveled look. But they also shouldn't have this shaved short hair, but should have something kind of mid-length, what we would consider long hair, but well-kept long hair. And the Septuagint is even clearer on this. It says, it doesn't say nor let their hair grow long. It says they shall not shave their heads nor pluck off their hair. So it seems pretty clear in the Septuagint that this vision of the temple, it shows priests with long hair. And we know, according to Hebrews 4:14, that Jesus is a priest. It says, seeing then that we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. So maybe it was customary for Jewish priests to have long hair, and Jesus assumed the look of a priest. Maybe that's the case. And if that is the case, and obviously he's an exception to the general rule, this custom of men having short hair. But a vocation that I think is especially applicable to Jesus is the vocation of prophet. In Jewish culture, the first century, it seems like prophets were typically understood to have long hair. So Josephus writes, so the child, he's talking about Samson, grew apace, and it appeared evidently that he would be a prophet, both by the moderation of his diet and the permission of his hair to grow. It's a very interesting wording in this statement, that it was evident that Samson would be a prophet by his long hair. Seems to be what Josephus is saying. He says something similar about Samuel. He says, dedicating him to God that he might become a prophet. Accordingly, his hair was suffered to grow long. So it seems like, again, this pattern of prophet, therefore long hair. This implies that the first century Jewish perspective was long hair was typical for prophets. Samuel had long hair. Ezekiel had long hair. You can see Ezekiel 5:1. So Jesus easily could have styled himself as a typical Jewish prophet with long hair. That would mean he falls outside of Paul's general rule for having short hair. And there's actually evidence for this in the New Testament by the fact that the Jews see Jesus and recognize him as a prophet. Matthew 21:11 says, so the multitude said, this is Jesus the prophet from Nazareth of Galilee. So if they're seeing him and they're saying, oh, yep, there's the prophet, maybe that's an indication that they recognized him as a prophet, at least partially from his look, his outward look, including long hair. And there's even some ancient iconographic evidence for this as well. You see, for example, icons of Jesus sitting with his disciples, and they all have short hair except for him, indicating that he's the prophet of the group. There's another vocation that's worth exploring, just throwing this out there. In Greek culture, and therefore probably Greco-Judean culture, philosophers had the custom of having long hair. This is very well known in the scholarship, but you can find this in the church fathers as well. St. John Chrysostom writes, but the men went so far as to wear long hair as having spent their time in philosophy, which was a Grecian custom. So perhaps Jesus allowed himself to have long hair to show himself as the supreme philosopher and display over Greek philosophy. So while 1 Corinthians 11:14 can be argued as laying a general rule, I can definitely see how that would be possible. It probably doesn't apply to a truly pious man, not a false pious man, but a truly pious man with long hair who's well kept, and doesn't apply absolutely as known through vocational exceptions. So any one of these exceptions that we know of from Greco-Judean culture could have applied to Jesus, and therefore he could have had long hair. So what about archaeological evidence in Greco-Roman portraits? What did these tell us about how Jews looked, and do they indicate that Jesus had short hair? Well, Fayum portraits from Egypt and paintings from Pompeii and Herculaneum show men with short to mid-length hair. There's almost no depictions of men with long hair like you'd expect from the typical conventional image of Jesus. So while not Judeans per se, they still provide evidence that shorter hair was the norm all around the empire, both in Latin and Greek provinces. They provide evidence, therefore, of Jesus looking like a typical man with short, at most mid-length hair. Is this a good argument? Well, the portraits don't show Judeans, so we can't establish Judean style with them with any certainty. Yeah, you could make a kind of inductive argument that it's likely that Jews looked like Egyptians and Latins, but at the end of the day, it's not really certain. You can't prove with 100% accuracy that they did look the same. In fact, some scholars seem to think that it was much more diverse than what we're seeing in these portraits. Mary Harlow writes, the great diversity of the Roman Empire means that its inhabitants would have known a range of hair colors and textures worn in a variety of styles. So even if you could demonstrate that short hair was the norm for Jews, it doesn't rule out the possibility that Jesus was an exception to the norm. Even in Roman art, we see a few little exceptions here and there. There's a man who seems to have long hair in the Arch of Titus, which dates to the 1st century. And he's a Roman man. And then there are some frescoes from Pompeii where men have what we might consider long hair. What about Judea Capta coinage? Okay, so these are coins that were produced after the fall of Jerusalem under the reigns of Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. And these coins have a depiction on them that seems to show a Jewish man and Jewish woman. And the Jewish man in this image has short hair. So is this a little snapshot of what the typical Jewish man looked like in the 1st century, showing him short hair? Well, maybe it is, okay? But even if this did establish short hair as the norm for Jews, again, doesn't rule out Jesus being an exception to that rule. Like we said, there's vocational exceptions that we know of from the Greco-Romano-Judean world. Besides, the identification of the man cannot be securely identified. It's not written there who he is. Is he a personification of Judah? Or is he a Jewish man symbolizing Judea? Is he a typical Jewish man? We don't know exactly who he is. We're kind of just taking it as we see it and speculating. And he's kind of naked with a cloth over him. And it seems to imply less an accurate description of a Jew and more of a Roman perspective of Jews look like. So his weird outfit or lack thereof seems to imply sort of Roman imagination of what a Jew looks like. So it's kind of questionable how accurate this depiction is of a Jew, but it's still interesting, and it still is some evidence that Jesus had short hair. It just doesn't prove it with absolute certainty. What about the synagogue in Dura Europos? Doesn't that show that Jews have short hair? Well, the synagogue in Dura Europos dates to the late 2nd century, early 3rd century. It shows many Israelites and men from the Old Testament, and most of them have short hair, which is very interesting. And this is strong evidence that short hair was the norm and aligns with the earliest iconography of Jesus. So how these Jews look in these paintings looks a lot like how Jesus is depicted by the earliest Christians. And if these are two witnesses of how Jews looked during the 1st century, then they might be accurate. So is this a good argument to establish a basis for a short-haired Jesus? Well, maybe, kind of. We can see here, this is the prophet Ezekiel, and this is his vision of the resurrection. And this is a group of Israelite men resurrected. And every single one of these men has relatively short hair. Not one of them has this long Jesus-looking hair. Well, the truth is, Dura Europos shows a diversity of hair lengths. Some men have short hair, others have long hair. So Moses, David, Ezra, they have short hair, but Ezekiel doesn't. King Solomon has long hair. The men in King Solomon's court all have long hair. So therefore, Dura Europos reinforces not the likelihood of Jesus having short hair, but the inconclusiveness of the question. So it just adds further inconclusiveness to this. We have the early Christian iconography. Well, sometimes Jesus has long hair, sometimes short hair. Then we have Dura Europos. Well, sometimes Jews have short hair, sometimes they have long hair. So it really doesn't add anything either way. It doesn't prove anything either way. It kind of gives us more inconclusiveness. So the question is still open. The data, therefore, does not prove that Jesus had short hair. Certainly there's evidence that he did, and that it's possible, and maybe even likely if he looked like a typical Jew. but the iconographic record is mixed. The Jewish writings and scriptures indicate that Jesus could have had short hair as a typical Jewish man, or that he had long hair as a prophet, priest, or philosopher. So let's look at some evidence that Jesus had long hair and see if those will prove that Jesus had long hair. So the first one is, wasn't Jesus a Nazarite? Therefore he had long hair. Numbers chapter 6 says, when a man or woman consecrates an offering to take a vow of a Nazarite, to separate himself to the Lord, he shall separate himself from wine and similar drink. All the days of the vow of his separation, no razor shall come upon his head. The problem with this argument is the Bible doesn't say that Jesus was a Nazarite. It says he was a Nazarene. In Matthew 2:23, it says, and he came and dwelt in a city called Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophets, he shall be called a Nazarene. A Nazarite, in Hebrew Nazir, in Greek Nazir or Nazireos, is a person who consecrates himself to God, makes that Nazarite vow. A Nazarene, that's a Nazoreos, is a resident of the town of Nazareth. So a Nazireos is not the same thing as a Nazoreos, two totally different things, even though they might sound similar. It's confusing. In fact, the Bible actually demonstrates that Jesus was not a Nazarite because he drank wine. In Matthew 11:19, Jesus said he came eating and drinking and was called a winebibber. He turned water into wine and used wine at Last Supper. So no, Jesus was not a Nazarite, so we can't prove anything with Numbers chapter 6 or Matthew 2:23. They don't prove anything about his hair. How about the Shroud of Turin, the Mandylion, the Veil of Veronica, or other miraculous images? Well, some say that Jesus had long hair, and they base this on the one miraculous image of him. Could be the Shroud of Turin, could be the Mandylion. And these arguments can be convincing to the faithful, and I'm not going to discredit them. But I will say it is difficult to prove. It's a whole other can of worms trying to base the image of Jesus on these images. You're going to have to build a case for their authenticity, which can be difficult and can be very contentious depending on your audience. In the case of the Mandylion, there are conflicting versions of the story. There's the Byzantine edition, the Eusebius edition, the Doctrine of Adi. They all tell the story of that image a little bit differently. So it's a little bit difficult to pin down, okay, what do you mean the Mandylion? Which version of it? The Mandylion has been lost since the 13th century, cannot be examined scientifically. So by the way, the Mandylion is from the Byzantine version of the story, is that Jesus took a towel and pressed his face on the towel and gave it to a man who brought it to King Agbar in the city of Edessa, and on that towel was a miraculous image of Jesus. So we don't have that image anymore. It was apparently lost in the 3rd century. And the Byzantine Mandylion icon type was painted probably around the 10th century. That's when it was brought from Edessa to Constantinople. And that's 1,000 years from when Jesus lived. So probably by that time, okay, it's almost 1,000 years, but by that time, the image was probably faded and the accuracy of our copies just can't be verified. So it's just, I'm not going to say it's false. I'm not going to say it's wrong. Of course, I can't prove that. We have a whole feast day about the Mandylion in the Orthodox Church. But it's just very difficult to prove anything with concrete details. It's going to be really, it's an uphill battle trying to do that. In the Shroud of Turin, Veil of Veronica, even if you could establish their authenticity, they only show Jesus during his passion. So they don't actually rule out the possibility of Jesus having short hair during his ministry years, which is what we see in the earliest iconography. The earliest iconography doesn't show Jesus during his passion, it shows him during his ministry years. So you could totally harmonize the Shroud of Turin with early Christian iconography showing Jesus with short hair if you say that these are just two different images from two different times in Jesus's life. So you can take both. You can say, well, the Shroud of Turin and early Christian iconography are both authentic witnesses of Jesus' appearance. What about Leviticus 19:27? Doesn't that prohibit Jews from having short hair? while some translations of Leviticus 19:27 seem to forbid Jews from cutting the sides of their hair. The New King James Version reads, "You shall not shave around the sides of your head." The ESV reads, "You shall not round off the hair of your temples." The question is, what is the original reading here and what does it mean? Are these good translations? Well, I don't think they are good translations. So the Hebrew of this text, if you look at it, it literally says, "You shall not round the sides of your heads." The King James Version has the most literal translation here. It says, "Ye shall not round the corners of your heads." Literally what it says. There's no word shave or cut. They're just not there. There are Hebrew words for shave and cut, which are used for shaving and cutting hair, but those words are not used in this passage. It says round, not cut or not shave. And the word round here, nakaf, it just means go around or surround or encompass, and it doesn't entail cutting. This word is used in Joshua 6:3. It says, "You shall go all around the city once." So talking about the people encircling the city, going around the city. That's the word that's being used, round. So what does it mean to round the side of your head? Well, obviously some translators interpret that as cutting, but there's another ancient interpretation in the Septuagint. The Septuagint reads, "You shall not make a hair roll out of the hair on your head." That's from Netz. Lexham has, "You will not make curled hair from the hair of your head." So this hair roll or curled hair is the Greek word sison, which unquestionably means curl of hair. It can't be mistaken for anything else. So it's very clear in the Greek, as interpreted by the Septuagint translators, that to round the hair means to curl the hair. And there's an interesting application of this passage in the Apostolic Constitutions. They date to the 4th century. And this interprets this passage pastorally to apply to men who lavishly adorn themselves to seduce women and cheat on their wives. So there's almost a kind of pastoral application, which makes a lot more sense than just an arbitrary, random, you can cut here, but you can't cut here. Just doesn't really mean anything as far as laws go. But if there's a sort of hidden moral message here to not curl your hair as a maybe a metaphorical way of saying don't use your body to entice others to sin, well, that makes a lot of sense in the character of God. But importantly for this discussion, the Septuagint interpretation is possibly and probably likely how Jesus and other Jews at the time understood the text, since the Septuagint was contemporary during Jesus' time. Thus, again, from this passage alone, we cannot determine whether Jesus had long hair or short hair. So, no, Leviticus 19:27, in its earliest interpretation that we know of from the Septuagint, doesn't refer to cutting the hair. The word cutting the hair is not even in that passage in Hebrew. By the way, the images in Dura Europos of Jews shows them with their hair cut. So obviously, those Jews were not understanding this passage to refer to cutting the hair. So they probably had this Septuagintal type understanding of the text. So in conclusion, the ancient iconographic record is mixed. Sometimes it shows Jesus with long hair, sometimes with short hair. Biblical and Jewish sources are inconclusive on Jesus' hair, showing that short hair was probably typical in Judea, but exceptions certainly existed, especially for certain vocations. In these vocations, most of which Jesus fills. Miraculous images are difficult or impossible to prove and do not show Jesus during his ministry years, okay, like the Shroud of Turin. So they can't really disprove that Jesus had short hair during his early life. The biblical passages used to show that Jesus had long hair are misinterpretations. Ultimately, the Bible is silent about Jesus's hair. Therefore, we cannot say conclusively that Jesus absolutely had short hair or absolutely did not have short hair, but it is certainly possible that he did have short hair at some point in his life. And I think that's the key takeaway from this is next time you see a picture of Jesus with short hair, don't just jump to that conclusion and say, oh, that's fake news. Say, well, it's possible. The evidence is pretty inconclusive on his hair length. So maybe it is possible that he had short hair. And especially because those depictions of him are from his early ministry years. Um, Short hair in ancient images of Jesus, therefore, should not be taken as license to discredit their reliability and call them Romanizations. Okay, so just because you see short hair on Jesus in early Christian iconography, that's not a license to just throw that iconography out the window and say completely fake. They might actually be onto something there when it comes to Jesus' authentic hair. So openness to Jesus having short hair early in his ministry does not contradict the Bible, does not prohibit us from holding the conventional image of Jesus with long hair as authentic, especially if you hold that that was Jesus's look during his passion. So I hope that's helpful, and I hope you found something interesting in there. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.
If